Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Oh, that was a really good response. Thanks, guys. If we have not had a chance to meet, my name is Rachel, and I lead the Next Gen teams here at City North, a family ministry, City North kids, City North students. And so that is one of the highest honors of my life, but right up there is getting to stand on the stage and talk to you guys, which I get to do a couple of times a year. So I am very excited to be a part of summer at City North this year. Now, have any of you all ever had a movie or a TV show or a story that you loved and you felt like, I really know what's happening here, this is really great, I really understand everything that's going on? And then either you get older or you get wiser, you get more knowledge, or someone comes in and says, hey, this is actually like this, and you realize you don't really know everything that's going on in this movie. When I was little, I loved the animated Little Mermaid, really loved the animated Little Mermaid. And I don't know if it's because it came out when I was 1 year old, so it was just kind of like a part of my burgeoning consciousness, or if it's because the songs were really great to sing in the bathtub, which I know that I did at full volume from both stories my parents have told me and from home movies. So needless to say, I was a little bit obsessed with The Little Mermaid. But when I watch it now, I kind of have a different feeling about it. I can understand why maybe the mermaids were concerned about a 16-year-old Ariel becoming obsessed with a man from, literally another species. I can understand why her dad was like, maybe you shouldn't get to do just whatever you want, especially if it's dangerous. There's even a line in Ariel's most famous song, A Part of Your World, where she says, I bet you on land they understand, but they don't reprimand their daughters. And I'm like, if that is true, that is not a good thing. Parents, you should be reprimanding your daughters and your sons if they are doing something that is, dangerous or hurtful. And so the older I've got, the more experience I've had, I view this story differently, and that happens to a lot of us, I think, at different points in our life. And today we are going to do something that we don't do very often at City North, but we did it just a couple weeks ago, and that is that we are going to go through an entire book of the Bible today. And this is a story that some of you maybe have heard, maybe you've heard part of it, and let me be clear, this is a beautiful story, even if you have only heard part of it. But this is one of those stories that the older I've gotten and the more that I have learned, I see this story so much differently and so much deeper. And it is such a beautiful picture of who God is in a different way. And so today we are going to talk about the book of Ruth, and that is about a third of the way through the Old Testament. So we're in the first half of the Bible before Jesus is on the scene, and it's only 4 chapters long. And the first sentence of Ruth sets up the book really well, everything we need to know. So we are going to dive right in. Ruth 1:1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, if you have ever attended a church Christmas Eve service, I am betting you have heard the name of the town of Bethlehem. That is where Jesus was born, where shepherds saw angels, wise men brought gifts. The whole nativity scene kind of happened in Bethlehem, so it kind of became a famous place. But there is another place mentioned here that you might not be as familiar with, and that is the country of Moab. And that was the country directly east from Israel and Judah. And these 2 countries have a history, and it's a little bit spicy. So in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis, we get the story of how God called a man named Abraham to follow him. But we also get the stories of some of Abraham's family, including a man named Lot. And Lot and his wife and his family lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and God was going to bring judgment on that city, and he gave Lot and his family a chance to get out. But he told them, don't look back at Sodom and Gomorrah, don't look back at the destruction. Well, Lot's wife did look back at the destruction, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Very dramatic. But Lot and his daughters did escape, and they end up in these caves. And Lot's daughters now pretty much assume their life is over. They have just seen their whole city destroyed. They just lost their mom. And they are looking at their dad, who is older, and they are afraid he is going to die and leave them to fend for themselves. And we have talked about it before, but I think it bears repeating. Being a single woman in the ancient world was precarious at best. You didn't have anyone to help you get food. You didn't have anyone to provide you protection. And you didn't really even have, women were not able to negotiate in the business world in the same way that men were. And so these daughters looking at their lives feeling like, this is over for us. We have nothing. They decide to hatch a plan. They decide they are going to have children with their father. Now listen, this was not a good plan. This was not a smart plan. Sometimes the Bible is not being prescriptive, it's just being descriptive. Sometimes the Bible is just telling us what happened, and it is not telling us that we should follow in those footsteps. Sometimes the Bible is just being descriptive. So Lot's daughters do have children with their father, and one of them is named Moab. So that is the people that live in the country of Moab. So this country didn't have a great reputation from the beginning. And then generations later, God is rescuing his people, Israel, from slavery in Egypt, and they kind of have to go through Moab to get to the land God is giving them. And the Moab people are not excited to let a new huge people group just settle in next to them, and they try to make it harder for them. They even hire a prophet named Balaam to curse the nation of Israel, even though God is the one leading them. And this is the story, if you ever want to look it up, where God made a donkey talk to Balaam and tell him that what he was doing was really stupid. So that's a really fun story about animals talking in the Bible. But Israel never really forgot that even once they had settled, they never forgot Moab tried to make it harder for them. So these two nations have a lot of mistrust between the two of them. And so this famine in Bethlehem had to have been pretty bad for an Israelite man. His name was Elimelech, and his wife Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to move to Moab. It must have been pretty bad for them to move to essentially an enemy country. The other important thing that the first sentence of Ruth tells us is when this story happens. When in history is this occurring? And it says that it was occurring during the time of the Judges. So the book, right before the book of Ruth, it's just called Judges, is the story of a really dark time in Israel's history where they get into this really destructive cycle. This cycle of they forget about God, and then something bad happens, and then God sends them a leader, and he rescues them, and then they forget about God again. And we just kind of keep this cycle going for a while, for generations. One of my Old Testament professors liked to call this the cycle of the down in Judges because it just kind of kept getting worse and worse. The way Judges, the author of Judges, describes this time is everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so this really dark and chaotic time is when the book of Ruth, the events of the book of Ruth happen. And so maybe that's part of the reason that Elimelech and Naomi moved their whole family to this other country. But for whatever reason, this family goes to Moab to seek their fortune, to pursue flourishing. But that's not what happens. After they are settled in Moab, among a people that they don't really trust, Elimelech dies. And the author says Naomi was left with her two sons. That's all she had left. And so how does this family seek flourishing? How do they seek to be secure in this new country? Well, her two sons marry Moabite women, one named Orpah and one named Ruth. Now, this would have been a little bit complicated because people from different nations did not worship the same gods. People from Moab would not have been worshiping this one true God of Israel. And so entering into a marriage with someone from another country, they would have had different priorities, different customs. There would have been just a tension there in that. But at least their family is kind of established now. They have roots in this area. They've married Moabite women. And there is a potential that this family could flourish without the husband. But then 10 years later, both of Naomi's sons die. And in those 10 years, neither Orpah or Ruth have had children. And to be clear, in an ancient world where there were very limited forms of birth control, the fact that these two young, seemingly healthy women, neither of them were able to get pregnant and bear a child, is very unusual. And so now we have Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, all widows, all single women without the protection of a man, of a leader in their household. And they don't really have provision either. And Naomi is in a foreign country. She has no family near her. She has no property that would belong to her family name. And Orpah and Ruth, by marrying the sons, have kind of become a part of Naomi's family. So all three of them are just kind of stuck in what seems like a pretty hopeless situation. And then Naomi hears that God had visited Israel and brought them food. AKA, the famine was over. And so she's looking around at her life in a foreign country and saying, this has not gone well. This move has brought nothing good to us, so I am going to go home. And her daughter-in-laws start on this journey with her because they are her family now. And honestly, any singular woman traveling across land on her own, not great. It's just what it was. But as they're on this journey, Naomi turns to her two daughters-in-law and she says this: "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And Naomi kissed them and tried to send them on their way, tried to send them back to Moab. Now, scholars are a little bit divided about whether or not Naomi was being purely altruistic here. I think it's clear that she cares very much for her daughters-in-law. She wants flourishing for them. And for women in the ancient world, that usually meant a husband and children. I think Naomi does want that for her daughters-in-law. But Naomi is also aware that she is heading back to Bethlehem in Israel with two Moabite daughters-in-law who would probably not be welcomed or trusted. And so maybe Naomi is just thinking it's going to be better for everyone if we all just kind of stay in our own homelands. But the daughters-in-laws aren't convinced. They love her. They don't want her to be alone. They don't want her to be unsafe. And so they kind of argue with them. And then argue with Naomi, and then she continues, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?" And so that might seem like a strange argument to us, future sons. But what Naomi is talking about is this ancient practice called the Levirate law. In Hebrew, it's called Yibam. And it's this practice where when a man dies, if he has a brother, his brother is allowed to and actually even encouraged to marry the dead man's widow. And as weird as that might sound for any of us who are married to picture our spouses marrying a sibling, it's sometimes a strange picture. The reason this practice existed was protection. Family property, which was not just I own property. Family property was how you had security and safety, and it's also how you made money, and it's how you ensured that future generations would be able to make money and take care of themselves. Family property was passed down through family lines, and so by a brother marrying his dead brother's widow, we were ensuring that the property would stay in that family, and the next generation of that family would be taken care of. And we were also protecting the widow. The widow was not going to be left alone to try to navigate the world on her own, to try to figure out how to make money. The widow would be taken care of. Now, in Israelite law, the widow was allowed to refuse this marriage, and if she did, then she was free to go back to her own family and restart her life, essentially. But this Levirate law, this practice of marrying your dead brother's spouse, was very common. And Naomi is essentially saying, look, I've lost my husband. We've lost the two sons. I don't have any more sons to give you. I have nothing to offer you if you continue on this journey with me. And so she's encouraging them to go home because she hopes that maybe their fortunes will turn around. And Orpah is finally convinced. She is crying. She is tore up about it. She does not really want to, but she's finally convinced that the wiser thing would be to go home, and she goes home. But Ruth will not be swayed. Ruth is staying with her mother-in-law, and this is a very famous speech that Ruth makes. It gets quoted a lot, but essentially the heart of it is, Ruth says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." So Naomi realizes at this point she is not going to convince Ruth, and they continue on their journey to Bethlehem. And what I find really interesting that is part of Ruth's explanation, her reason for saying, "Stop trying to convince me, I'm going with you," is that she wants to make Naomi's God her God. So she has seen enough of the one true God of Israel that she is willing to leave behind her family and her customs and even her religion behind and go with Naomi, who doesn't really have much to offer. And from everything we've just learned about the relationship between Israel and Moab and what it was like for women in the ancient world, Ruth was going home with Naomi to essentially live in poverty, and she knew that. She was signing up to go home with Naomi to live in poverty. But to Israel and Judah they went, and when they got to Bethlehem, the Bible says the whole city was stirred up because of them. Naomi's been gone a long time. She probably looks a little different, and she's coming back with a single daughter-in-law and none of the men that she left with. And so, they're all surprised to see her, and they're like, "Oh, Naomi, Naomi." And this is what Naomi says to them. She says, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. She said, "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune on me. So I think that's all we need to know about Naomi's state of mind when she arrived back in Bethlehem. She feels like God has dealt her such a crushing blow that she is not even the same person anymore. She doesn't even want to go by the same name anymore because she does not recognize that person. And she feels like God has done this to her directly. And let's take stock of what happened. Her homeland experienced a famine so bad that her family chose to move to an enemy country where she watched her husband die and then her 2 sons die, and she is left alone with 2 daughters-in-law that she has no chance of taking care of. It has not been a good season. So as we approach the end of the first section of Ruth, Naomi and Ruth are kind of left in this really seemingly hopeless situation. But here's how the author of Ruth actually ends section 1. Ruth 1:22. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. And according to Bible scholar N.T. Wright, this, Dave, if you want to leave that up there for a couple minutes, this is one of the most hope-filled verses in the Old Testament. Now, if you are not a person who lives in the ancient Near East near a barley field, I think it's fair to ask, why is this a hope-filled verse? This does not sound like a hope-filled verse. But baked into God's law was ways to care for the poor, ways to care for widows and foreigners so that they would literally not starve to death. So God's people were instructed that when they were harvesting things, they were to leave a perimeter unharvested. They were to not touch that. And they were to leave anything that fell on the ground. And anyone who didn't have their own food could come and harvest that food for themselves. And so Naomi and Ruth arriving in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest means they are not going to starve to death immediately. They have an option for food. The author is telling us that they may have arrived hungry and empty, but they aren't going to stay that way. That's how we end section 1. So section 2 starts. Naomi and Ruth settle into Bethlehem, and Ruth offers to go gather grain in this way that I just described, along the edges and picking up what's off the ground. And Ruth ends up picking grain in a field owned by a man named Boaz. And the Bible describes Boaz as a kinsman of Naomi's husband. So we've already established family is a really important thing in the ancient world, and not just in a like, you should take care of your family kind of way, but like it is how business happened. And so the Bible pointing out that Boaz is a kinsman of Elimelech, of Naomi's husband, is a kind of this is a big bright shadow foreshadowing situation. And so this is a big deal that is the field that Ruth starts picking in. So Ruth is gathering, and Boaz comes to his field to oversee the work, and he asks his workers, who's this young woman? Who does she belong to? Because again, women were under the protection of a man. And when they tell him, this is Ruth, the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi, Boaz realizes the precarious position that Ruth is in. She is a single young woman who is from another country, who is living with an old woman on welfare. And their version of welfare is they have to go pick grain all day in a field surrounded by men. So they're going to eat, but it is still not safe. And so Boaz goes out of his way to tell Ruth, hey, stay in my fields. I have told my servants to not touch you. He goes out of his way to tell Ruth how to get water midway through the day without leaving his property to make sure that she is still safe. And when Ruth is like, what? Why are you doing this? I am a foreigner. You don't know me. Why are you being so kind to me? This is what Boaz says. I know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. So Ruth and Naomi's story has been heard. Ruth's reputation as like an honorable and loyal person kind of goes before her. And Boaz says, I am so impressed with the care you have for your mother-in-law that I'm going to watch out for you, and I am praying that God watches out for you too. And so he goes above and beyond. He tells his workers to drop extra grain on the ground so she could pick up more grain. He sends her home with more, and he does this for months. The Bible says that Ruth was picking all the way through the barley harvest and then into the wheat harvest. So that is from March to the beginning of July. Boaz is looking out for her this whole time. And while Boaz's kindness and Ruth's hard work is keeping her and Naomi fed, it's still a precarious situation because they are dependent on what is being picked in the harvest, and harvest is going to end. And so Naomi's I got to figure out a longer-term solution here. I want to take care of Ruth longer term. And so in chapter 3, Naomi kind of hatches a matchmaking plan. And this is where I, again, have to remind you that sometimes the Bible is descriptive and not prescriptive. Scholars are very divided on the wisdom and morality of this plan, which when I explain it to you, I think will become obvious that it is controversial. But again, sometimes the Bible is just telling us, this is what happened. This is what happened. So it's near the end of harvest season. Boaz and his men would have been working long hours. There was probably some celebrating and partying going on with the fact that they were coming to an end of this really long season of hard work. And Naomi knows that Boaz is going to be working late on the threshing floor. And so she tells Ruth to wash herself, to put on some perfume, to put on her nicest clothes, and to sneak into the threshing floor after Boaz has eaten and drunk and is, quote, in good spirits. Euphemism for having imbibed, implied. Okay, just let's be clear about that. So that is what Ruth does. She sneaks into the threshing floor, and Naomi had told her to uncover Boaz's feet and lay down, and then Boaz would tell her what to do. Now, here's where scholars get a little bit spicy. Christian scholars translate this very literally, that Ruth uncovered Boaz's feet and then laid down. Jewish scholars translate the use of the word feet here as a euphemism for another part of the male anatomy. So you can see why this story, this plan might be controversial. And if the Jewish interpretation is what Naomi was asking Ruth to do, that could put her and Boaz in a really precarious position. Like they would be publicly shamed and Boaz would be kind of forced to marry Ruth. So I don't know what actually happened. I was not there. And I don't know what Naomi's actual intentions were. But either way, Ruth and Boaz are such upstanding, godly people that neither one of them compromised their morals or their reputation. Ruth does sneak in, and then Boaz wakes up and finds her there and is kind of like, what are you doing here, strange woman? And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread the corner of your covering over me, since you are a family redeemer. So she is essentially saying, I am asking you to redeem the land that would have been my husband's and to marry me. Because, again, when a spouse died, that land could be sold off if they were in poverty. But if it was sold off, it was supposed to be bought by a family member so that the family member could keep that land in the family. And so Ruth is very boldly saying, I would like you to do this thing. And honestly, Boaz is honored. He compliments her loyalty and her honor. And he says, I am surprised that you came to me. I am older. There are a lot of younger men who I am sure you would be more excited to marry. But he knows that she is a very godly woman. But he also has to tell her that Boaz is not the closest relative of Elimelech, which means he is not first in line to get to redeem this property. He is not first in line to get to buy this property. But he is so kind. This is what he says to Ruth. Don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do whatever is necessary, for everyone in town knows you are a virtuous woman. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him, this other man. If he is willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he is not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. Now lie down here until morning. So we see Boaz not only being kind of above reproach when, he's alone with a beautiful young woman in the middle of the night, which honestly is just another in a long line of stories about Boaz being a godly man. But we also see he's going above and beyond. He is promising Ruth that he will personally ensure her and Naomi are taken care of. And I want to pause here and wonder what Ruth must have been feeling. She is still a relatively young woman, but she's been married for 10 years and hasn't been able to conceive a child. And that would have been an absolute point of pain and shame for her. And then she watches her husband die. Another reason to grieve. And then she decides to follow her mother-in-law to a foreign country where she knows that it's very possible that she might be treated like a second-class citizen. And for the past several months, she has been working day and night, picking grain just so they have something to eat. And now her mother-in-law is sending her out on this very obvious matchmaking scheme. And I don't know if Ruth understood all of the ins and outs of a Levirate law in Israel, or if she was just kind of repeating what Naomi told her to say. I don't know. But I do know Ruth was very aware her fate, both for that one night and for the rest of her life, rested on this one man. And I am guessing she did not sleep well that night. That would just be me. But the next morning, Boaz gets Ruth home, and no one sees. Their reputations are secure. And then Boaz goes to work solving this kind of logic puzzle, this legal puzzle that they're in. He meets with the other man who would be first in line to purchase the property, and he meets with him in a public square, so everything is legal and above board. And he tells him, hey, Naomi is interested in selling this property, and you are first up to buy it. And at first, the guy is really excited. Of course, he wants to expand his holdings. He wants to have more property. But then Boaz says it would include taking Ruth as your wife. And now the other guy is not so sure that he wants this. Not because of who Ruth is, but because if he and Ruth had a child, their first child would actually belong to Ruth and her first husband. That's how Levirate law worked. And so the property would remain in the line of Elimelech and Naomi and their family. And so now this guy is concerned, what if that breaks up his other property? What if that breaks up his family's property? And so he says, you know what? I don't want it. Boaz, you are free to go buy this property, and you are free to take Ruth as your wife. So after they make the arrangement all legal, there's like an exchange of sandals. I don't know. It was weird. It was another time. Boaz takes Ruth into his home, and she becomes his wife. And this starts what I think is one of the most beautiful endings of a book in the Bible. So Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. When he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women of the town said to Naomi, "Praise the Lord who has provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age, for he is the son of your daughter-in-law, who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons." This makes me want to cry every time. I don't know in the ancient world if you could pay a woman a higher compliment to say that she has been better than 7 sons. That most of the time family lines were talked about under the men's name. He doesn't say, you've been given a child who is the son of Boaz. He says, you have been given a child who is the son of your daughter-in-law. This is the highest compliment a woman could receive. And then Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he was her own. And the neighborhood women said, now at last, Naomi has a son again. Do you remember how Naomi described herself when she arrived in Bethlehem? She described herself as afflicted and empty. She had lost her husband, the leader of her household, and her protector and her provider. She had lost her sons, which were her hope for the future. And she was convinced that God was doing this to her directly. And now, not only has God given her a redeemer for her family property, but he has given her a son that Ruth and Boaz hand to her, and she essentially raises Ruth and Boaz's son as her own, and they name him Obed. And Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. And if that name rings a bell, yes, I am talking about that David. I am talking about the David and Goliath David, the king of Israel David, the David who wrote most of the Psalms, one of the most important men in the history of Israel. And David is an ancestor to Jesus. So God took Naomi, who lost everything, and was convinced that God was out to get her, and Ruth, a foreign widow who wasn't even a part of Israel's nation and could very well have been barren, and through their story, made them a part of some of the most important stories in the history of the world. Through their pain and despair and hopelessness, God brought hope. And there's a lot of things we could take from the story of Ruth today. As a woman who grew up in the church, this story was used as an example of marriage, and we were all told, wait for your Boazes. And I think Ruth's loyalty and her honor and her hard work and her steadfastness is an example to all of us. But the older I get, and the more I know about the culture that this story comes from, the more I don't see this story about Naomi and Ruth individually. I see this story as a story of what God was doing. God baked hope into this story from the very beginning. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This book is a beautiful reminder that no matter how hopeless the story looks, there is always hope. God builds hope into his stories from the very beginning. And the reason there is hope is because God can redeem things that no one else can. God can provide a way for poor widows and foreigners to be fed. God can take a questionable arranged marriage situation and rescue an entire family. God can give a child to an old widow who had lost everyone she loved. There's a song that we sing here sometimes called Rattle, and my favorite line of the song is the first line of the bridge. My God is able to save and deliver and heal and restore anything that he wants to. And when I sing this song, this is kind of a fight song for me. Does anyone else have Songs like that, worship songs that are fight songs that you sing kind of angry, or is it just me? That's fine. It's fine if it's just me. But I have worship songs that I sing when I feel like I'm overwhelmed, when I feel like the story I'm living is not good. I have songs that I sing when I'm wrestling with that. When I say, my God is able to save and deliver and heal and restore anything that he wants to, I am saying that to the events in my life that are telling me my story is not good. I am fighting against that story. When I say in another song, you say your yoke is easy, you say your burden is light, I'm a little bit fighting with God there. I'm a little bit fighting with God saying, hey, you said these things. I need to see what they mean. I need to see them in my own life. When I say, I'll take you at your word, if you said it, I believe it, I'm saying you said you would overcome the world. You said that if I trusted you, you would give me the desires of my heart. You said these things. I literally have a YouTube playlist titled Fight Songs. I do. Because the reality is, I believe so deeply that God has built hope into his stories from the beginning, but sometimes we have to fight to find hope. It's not just there. Sometimes we have to fight to find it. Sometimes, like Ruth, we have to go to a strange land, trusting that God's going to meet us there. Sometimes, like Ruth, we have to do hard, thankless work just to stay alive. Sometimes, like Naomi, we have to be honest about where we're feeling. And sometimes when our story looks the most hopeless, we have to, finding hope looks a lot more like fighting. I have been thinking about this message since March. In March, we did a message series called This is War, where we talked about the reality of spiritual warfare and the reality that there are invisible forces around us that affect the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see God, that affect the way we interpret our lives into story. And there was one particular Sunday where Andrew did a message called Who is the Enemy? And he talked a lot about how our enemy is never flesh and blood. Our enemy is never against one other person. It is against these spiritual forces that are telling us something different about God or ourselves that isn't true. And he did a great job. But that was one of the crazier Sundays I have ever experienced in a lifetime of Sundays. He did one of our church's first altar calls, and many of you came forward because you wanted to do something physical with your body. You needed to ask God, that you needed to share with God that you needed to see more hope in your life. And then a whole bunch of people left this auditorium, walked out those doors to someone they trusted, and admitted that they were not doing okay. And several of them started their counseling journey that day or that week. Some of you are in the room today who started that day. And there's one conversation I had in particular with a City North family member, and I am not going to share this person's really personal and tender story. But trust me when I say, they've been dealt a really unfair hand. There is pain and trauma and death and despair and grief and loneliness. It's there. And the conversation that day started with, is it just time for me to give up on this dream? Is it just time to not have this dream anymore? Is God asking me to give up on this dream? And this is a dream I've had my whole life. It is a godly dream. It's not a bad thing. And I know the Bible says God wants to give me the desires of my heart. But I know Jesus also said, God, not my will, but your will. Is it God's will for me to just give up on this dream? And I was just reminded of how Naomi described herself in Ruth, that she was afflicted and empty, and that God had brought misfortune on her. And those feelings are absolutely real. I don't think God is thrown off kilter by us wrestling with those feelings. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we were having conversations about hope during a sermon series on warfare, because sometimes we have to fight to find hope. But in that conversation in March, the only answer I had was, I don't know. I don't know. And I am sure that was not encouraging or helpful. Hopefully it was helpful. I know it wasn't encouraging. I don't know why this person has had so many painful life experiences. I don't know. I don't know if God is asking this person to give up on this dream. I don't know if God is saying, hey, my will is something different for you, because I can't speak for God on that, and I don't know. And I have to say to you, I don't know the reason for the pain you've experienced. I don't know why you've had life experiences that have turned you into a person you don't recognize. I don't know why you went to seek flourishing and you have found yourself empty. I don't know. But I do believe that God builds hope into his stories from the very beginning. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That was there from the very beginning. If God's laws can provide hope for people, for foreigners and widows and the poor, people who have nothing to offer and who cannot rescue themselves, God can take a foreign, barren widow and add her to the lineage of the Savior of the world. God can take a bitter, lonely, elderly woman and give her a child and a family. God can save and deliver and heal and restore anything that he wants to. Sometimes we just have to fight to find that hope. So fight to find the ways that God has already provided for you, blessed you, redeemed you. Fight to hold on to God as your hope when your story tells you otherwise. The story of this church has looked a lot like fighting to find hope. I don't know the number of times I literally prayed, God, will you just give us a win today? But we just need one win today because we needed some hope. And he delivered every time. And so that is what I'm going to pray for you guys today. Let's pray.